Good evening, and thank you all for joining us here for this talk regarding sort of the umbrella of what's it going to take. And we're having an in-depth conversation about reproductive rights. I am Dr. Jennifer Dixon-McKnight. I'm an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Winthrop University. And I'd like to go around to our other guests and allow them to introduce themselves before we get started with this evening's conversation. Shannon, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll be happy to. I'm Shannon Bauerle. I'm an instructor in Women and Gender Studies at UNC Charlotte. I'm also the founder and director of Project Enough, which focuses on giving space for marginalized stories in the community. I also am the volunteer executive director of Charlotte for Choice, a local reproductive justice organization. Thank you.
All right, and good evening. My name is Rev Tara Gibbs. I currently serve as one of the associate ministers at Myers Park Baptist Church right here in Charlotte. But I also do a lot of work and study primarily in the Christian education field, and I have a particular interest in reproductive justice as it relates to faith and religion.
Thank you both for joining us this evening. I'm so excited about the opportunity to engage in this discussion. We know that there are a lot of sort of hot button topics that fall under the discussion of reproductive rights, particularly in more recent experience. There's a lot of things that have unfolded legally. There are a lot of things that are going on in the lives of individuals across the country in regards to reproductive rights. It is an ongoing conversation. And it's interesting because I've been working with my students and we do current events. And I've had so many students in my US history survey courses that are doing current events about the issues that have come up in the last couple of years around reproductive rights. So I want to sort of give us a little context. We can't tell it all. There is so much history as it pertains to the experiences of women in particular. Of course, reproductive rights don't exclude, or the conversation of reproductive rights does not exclude men. But I think this evening, a lot of our focus was sort of directed at the experiences of women in terms of reproductive rights. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the history, some touch points that we can sort of use to guide us in our conversation about reproductive rights, and some of the individuals and experiences and moments that we can highlight to sort of help guide us in our understanding of how reproductive rights have evolved in our nation's experience. So I think one of the things I want to just sort of start off talking about is the realities of the experiences of women in sort of our nation's early history, right? And the understanding was that women were considered to be the property of her husband. She wasn't allowed to sort of make decisions in regards to her reproductive health, her reproductive experience in terms of childbearing. You're talking about early American history where there is no birth control available for married women in particular. It isn't considered legal. And so there's a lot of restrictions on the experiences of women, very little autonomy in regards to their bodies and what they can do with their bodies. We see a lot of sort of changes happening when we start moving through the late 1800s, early 1900s. We start to see some pushback, particularly as you see more women moving out of domestic spaces and challenging the notion that women are tied to the home and to the home only. You see more women who are questioning their position as homemakers, questioning the idea that their only sort of contribution or the bulk of their contribution is tied to the home in terms of childcare, being a wife, being a mother. And we see moments like, and individuals like Margaret Sanger, who becomes prominent in the early 1900s. She, is someone who is born in upstate New York. Her mother gives birth to 11 children. And Margaret is sort of encouraged and fueled by the fact that her mother has 11 children. She dies young. She dies at 50. And Margaret sort of is convinced that her mother dies because she's poor, for one. So she doesn't have adequate health care. She doesn't have adequate support in regards to, successfully and in a healthy way moving through 11 pregnancies, and just not having the ability to decide for herself, right? Whether she wants to be pregnant or not, whether she wants to continue to have babies. Women in that time period, that wasn't something they necessarily had control over. So Margaret Sanger goes on to become someone who becomes vocal and an activist in regards to reproductive rights for women. She opened a birth control clinic in the early 1900s. She sets her sights on repealing the Comstock Law, which was a law passed that made it illegal to distribute obscene materials. And during that time, information about birth control was considered obscene. And so opening a birth control clinic, producing publications that talked about birth control, all of those things were considered illegal. So she opened a birth control clinic. She was arrested. It was shut down. She did it again later in the 19 teens. That ultimately becomes the Planned Parenthood of America, Federation of America. But she becomes sort of one of the front runners in regards to women's rights, women's reproductive rights, birth control movement, creating spaces where women can talk about these things, where women can get the assistance that they need, get the health care that they need, and also have some control, some autonomy over their bodies and deciding sort of how they move forward, and being able to decide for themselves what that looks like, and getting the resources that would help them in that process and to handle those things in a healthy way. And so, we think about that as one of the major touch points. We also think about sort of another other side of that, with women getting pregnant and having no recourse in pregnancy and a lack of resource in pregnancy. The other piece of that is well, other side of that would be women not ever being given the opportunity to get pregnant. We know that there is a history of forced sterilization in this country. And so not only is on the one hand, women don't have any control over pregnancy and when they get pregnant, the other side of that is women being sort of forced to give up the option of pregnancy. And so there's a number of examples, and we'll talk about some of those at various points this evening. But one would be the North Carolina eugenics movement, where North Carolina passes laws as early as 1919, I believe it was, that authorizes, legally sanctions forced sterilization for men and for women. We see a shift later. By the time we get to the 1960s, late 1960s, we start to see issues of race and class play into determining who's sterilized. We also see issues of gender, questions about mental fitness. We also see the issue of sex becoming sort of at the core of the decisions around who's sterilized and who's sort of eligible or targeted for those procedures. We know that historically we've had a number of cases. I think one of my sheroes, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a major civil rights activist in the 1960s and 70s, is one of those victims of forced sterilization in Mississippi, as an African American woman who goes in for a procedure to remove a uterine tumor, and comes out with no uterus. She's had a forced hysterectomy without her consent. And she referred to them as Mississippi appendectomies, because the practice of forced sterilization against Black women in particular in Mississippi was so common, that it was one of those things that women feared, Black women in particular feared in Mississippi. So we know that there's a history around this issue. We know that part of the concern was women having the autonomy and the power to decide whether they could have when they had children. There's also the concern historically around women having sex for pleasure, and that being something that was sort of off limits and unacceptable and considered inappropriate. And so these were some of the things that fueled a resistance to women having autonomy and being able to have access to birth control, to being able to determine and decide for themselves about their reproductive experience. We know that as just another sort of key moment, Roe v. Wade, right, which begins in 1970, after birth control becomes available in the mid 1960s, I believe, for married women, and I think in the 1970s for single women, birth control finally becomes legally available for those groups of women. And then there's a question about, well, what happens when women get pregnant and have an unwanted pregnancy? Who then gets to decide how that process works? Who then gets to decide for a woman what's appropriate? And so up until Roe v. Wade, a woman's husband had the ability to decide for her whether she was able to terminate a pregnancy or not, for instance, or a young lady's father had the ability to decide for her whether an abortion was appropriate. So Roe v. Wade opens up a whole new avenue in terms of women's reproductive rights, expanding women's access, giving them the ability to decide even further in different ways in regards to how they could move forward in their reproductive journey. And so just sort of giving some touch points in terms of the sort of highlights, we could spend a whole semester, right, a whole year talking about the various ways in which women have experienced reproductive rights or the lack thereof. And so I'm going to step back and move on to get Shannon Bauerle to talk a little bit with us about sort of where we are now. What is the conversation in terms of reproductive rights in our current context? You know, where are we now in terms of post Roe v. Wade? What is the current debate? So if you'll share a little bit with us about that, Shannon.
Sure. First off, reproductive rights or choice does not equate to access. That's assuming that, you know, that we are an equitable society, and we just are not. So that's important to note first. I also want to say that some of the rules, some of the things we'll talk about, laws, we use the term women. It's not just women that get pregnant. Trans men get pregnant. Non-binary folks get pregnant. So I just want to clarify that as we begin to it. It's more difficult right now in today's world to get a legal, safe abortion than it was in the 17th century in the U.S., or I should say occupied, taken land. Abortion was safe. Abortion was mandated. It was important. It was part of the society. Even the Puritans had abortion. It was not unusual. It was primarily done by midwives. So the history is there of it being accepted. You mentioned Dr. Dixon-McKnight mentioned the Comstock laws. Absolutely, with the contraception was lustful and was going to cause promiscuity. It's also around that time, interesting enough, we start seeing these laws against abortion. But even then, it was just about abortion was legal up until the quote unquote quickening, which is roughly around 18, 20 weeks. That's when the fetus should feel movement. And the health of the mother was predominantly the most important to that point. Now, you mentioned Roe v. Wade, obviously, which is the big one. I know it's a big topic of discussion to it. Roe Wade, just a little background for those who may not be familiar with it. It's 1973. Norman McCorvey is someone who's Jane Roe that is seeking to have an abortion. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize that she did not have an abortion, which is ironic with Jane versus Wade, but Roe versus Wade, sorry. But she didn't have an abortion. She went through the courts for 3 years. She actually had to have a baby, give it up for adoption, and then her name gets tagged on it. So with that was the idea with Roe Wade was to test the constitutionality of abortion. That it was, and this matters for later on our discussion, what's happening now, it was going against the right of privacy, the 14th Amendment. And so that you had a right to reasonable privacy. And that's how it began. And then we started seeing, once Roe Wade happened, then we started seeing like the Hyde Amendment that happened only 3 years later. The Hyde Amendment kept anyone from using Medicare, except for extreme cases, to use Medicaid for abortion, no matter what. And hundreds of women died because of that. Hundreds of pregnant people were not able to pay their rent. And we see it even today. This is nothing new. Pay their rent, pay basic bills, take care of the children they have because of that amendment. Another interesting thing that happened, and I think we talked about it earlier, was after Roe Wade, we started seeing an increase in anti-choice movements. Anti-choice movements didn't really take off until the mid-60s. In fact, to a large part, the Christian and Catholic Church were in high debate about it. What constitutes a pregnancy? What constitutes life? What first breath? That type of thing. But beginning in the mid to late 70s, going into the 80s, we started seeing these different factions of anti-choice movements, predominantly tied to the church. We had Operation Rescue, which is one of the more well-known, that has evolved now into Operation Save America. This started off and has continued to be groups that try to limit access to clinics. They go against the FACE Act, the ability to have access to clinics. You're not, like in North Carolina, for example, you're not supposed to prohibit someone from entering into a clinic. You're not supposed to stop them. You're not supposed to keep them in any way from seeking health care. However, that still happens. It's supposed to be a misdemeanor. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily happen hardly at all today. So, and with Roe Wade, I don't know how far you want me to go with this, but we are coming up in June, maybe early July, with Roe Wade falling, and it more than likely will fall. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, but I think probably the audience is seeing on the news. I couldn't even keep up with all of it. There's been almost 550 just since 2021 restrictions, bans placed on abortion here in the States. That's a lot. That's more than anything. We're talking maybe 100 around Roe Wade for a while. That's huge. And so a lot of people don't realize Roe Wade's already gone. And especially for marginalized communities, it never really was there for the most part. And so as we continue our discussion, I think that's something, we can talk about certain states and how it has impact and will impact as well, because it is more than likely going to fall. So that's a little background into it.
Thank you. And so the question for both of you is, what are the ramifications? If Roe v. Wade is reversed, or if it falls, as you said, what will we see, not just at a national level, but what will we see at a state level and a local level? And even thinking about, because you mentioned, Shannon, that for some communities, it never has existed. It hasn't been anything they've been able to take advantage of or, be able to be supported by. So what are going to be some of the ramifications of this?
Well, abortion is still going to happen. I can promise you that. It's just going to be access is even more limited. I'll speak just to North Carolina. Even right now, with Roe Wade still there, 91% or 91 of the 100 counties in North Carolina do not have clinics, do not have abortion clinics. Now, out of those 9 counties, there's only 15 clinics. There are, and it has changed over the past even week. There's 8 states that only have, 6 states are going back and forth, that only have 1 abortion clinic. So once again, that limits access even more so. So when Roe Wade falls, you're going to see something called trigger laws. These are laws that are in place in at least 13 definitely have them. 13 more other states have them in one form or another, that when Roe Wade gets reversed, automatically abortion can be banned. There may be limitations on it, but overall they have those laws in place that it can be banned. And what that means is, for those states that abortion is still legal in, with state mandated, then those folks that are seeking abortion care are going to have to travel That means they're going to have to spend more money. That means they're going to have to get childcare. That means they're going to have to find transportation. That means they're going to have to try to escape restrictions in states now where they can get fined 10,000, charged for murder, all these different things. And it's going to put a heavier burden on those states too, those clinics that I mentioned. When you've got only some states with only one clinic, or somewhat, where it becomes automatically illegal, they're going to travel. It's still going to be care being sought. But
let me ask this question, and then I want to hear what you have to say as well, Reverend Gibbs, but I want to ask a follow-up to what you're saying, Shannon, about this lack of access, and even like using North Carolina as an example. And you're saying that, we understand that abortions are going to continue to happen because they happened even before they were legal, right? We know that there's always been some people have figured out ways to terminate pregnancies, right? Or to find them the solutions to their issues. And we know that with those sort of illegal abortions, we saw high rates of women dying and experiencing sort of irreparable or irreversible damage to their bodies. Are we going to return to that?
I think, well, first I would say abortion has existed as long as reproductive care, as long as pregnancy has existed. It has existed. People trying to have ownership of their body and limiting that. I think in some cases we will see, obviously, harm being done because people will seek out whatever ways they can in order to make themselves better. But the thing is, rich, wealthy people, and I would include white women, will be able to get abortions. We're going to be able, the people that have money will be able to have access to abortion care. That's where we talked about race and being tied together. That is key to remember. That's why I mentioned the term access. Because if I'm able to afford a plane ticket and to be able to pay a doctor, or be able to pay, even say it's not legal, but be able to pay someone who's willing to do it in a safe environment, then I'm going to be just fine. But someone else will not, that can't afford that, or doesn't have the childcare, does not have the resources that I have. And I think that even furthers the disparity between these marginalized communities, and it is going to harm marginalized communities even more than they're already harmed.
Okay. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on this, Reverend Gibbs, in terms of the ramifications?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Dr. Dixon-McKnight, because as Shannon answered on one side, on the political side, I immediately thought of the patient side of things, right? When we already do have particularly Black, Indigenous, other marginalized community groups trying to just access abortion even now while it's somewhat accessible, right? While it's somewhat legal in many areas, there's still a struggle, whether it's financial, whether it's just logistical. And so to your point that was just said, those abortions are still going to happen. They're not going to be safe. They're going to be dangerous. There's going to be a lot of harm. It concerns me, particularly as a Black woman, when our pregnancy and birth mortality rates are already ridiculously high. That's going to increase. We're going to see more children in these government systems. People are going to be struggling more. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be good for those individuals, but it's not going to be good for us as a community of people, right? I don't know if you want to do that here now, but I definitely wanted to talk a little bit about that history piece, thinking about abortions already existing, which let me say this real quick. The elephant in the room, perhaps for many people, is, the minister is here to share some information on reproductive justice. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm here because for many people, that the basis of reproductive justice and their opinions and beliefs and thoughts begin from their sense of morality or right and wrong. And for the majority of people, that is situated in a spiritual place for them, right? Some kind of religious practice or faith tradition. And as Shannon mentioned, as long as pregnancy has been in existence since the beginning, then there has been abortion, for example, in existence. There have been attempts at contraceptives, right? Whether they were healthy or not, or safe or not. There have always been. And we even see that in scripture, right? People love to point to the Christian Bible as evidence of why not to have these reproductive justice and access to abortion and other reproductive healthcare medical opportunities. But it's in scripture, right? So this is not a new idea. This is not a new concept. It's interesting, particularly to hear the arguments now from a spiritual place, particularly amongst those who identify as Catholic, because as Shannon hinted at just a moment ago, this is new. This is new for the religious right. This is only a few decades old, this concern with reproductive justice, and particularly about abortion, because even the early church fathers, right? You know, your Augustine, your Clement, your Jerome, they were having these discussions. They were having these conversations about what they called family planning, and wrote about abstinence and all of these concerns about birth control. And it really all came back to patriarchy and control of female identified persons. We get a little bit later with the Reformation. Protestants were opposed to what they kind of called unnatural birth control, and it was still a conversation. And when it leads us to where we get to Catholics more recently, and the evangelical Christian tradition, those that are very right-leaning, if you will, politically as well, conservative. And that push, when they really recognized, and this is what people don't know, that they had no further say in authority when it came to race issues, they had to find another issue to hop on. And look at these abortions increasing right after Roe v. Wade, right? The access is there. People, birthing persons, are taking advantage of it. And a little people were a little uneasy about that. And so the evangelicals took advantage of that uneasiness in particular and said, let's jump on this. This is our moral issue. This is wrong. But it's just all very fascinating to see that hard shift to pick up on this issue as a moral dilemma, especially when you recognize the roots in that they lost their authority when it came to segregation and race. And so this was the new issue.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, sort of the ways in which these types of issues create such an intersectionality. There are so many people that are sort of fighting this fight, right? That are representatives of so many different communities. And so, and you mentioned the issue of race, but we also know that when we're talking about reproductive rights, reproductive justice, it's also an issue that brings up issues of class, right? Issues of identity, issues of religion. I think, your point of view is important. And I think you're right. The elephant in the room, people would be probably, or some people would be surprised and sort of question, the involvement of people in ministry, right, in this conversation. But I would argue that we all need to have a part in this conversation, right? I'm sort of adamant about the information and the knowledge being the thing that breaks back ignorance and the thing that tears down, an unwillingness to understand the plight, particularly of marginalized communities, particularly of underserved communities, particularly of individuals that are or still remain voiceless, right, in all of these areas. And so absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about, so we know that abortion is sort of one of the things that comes up sort of central in a conversation about reproductive rights, reproductive justice. But what other issues are a part of or should be a part of this conversation in regards to reproductive rights? And either of you, both of you, please answer the question. But can I hear from Reverend Gibbs first, and then we'll go to Ms. Bauerle?
Sure. I'll just say a few, and I'm sure Shannon has some others, because you've already hit the nail on the head. This is another issue that is intersectional. There is no way to just talk about just this issue without talking about class, without talking about race, without talking about immigration. I mean, it's all tied, without talking about patriarchy, feminism, all these things. It's all tied together. And at the end of the day, I think you're right, Dr. Dixon-McKnight, too, that these conversations have to take place, and we need to hear from all sides. I saw this interesting article some time ago that broke it down, that the concerns of people in the global north, when it comes to reproductive justice and abortion in particular, comes to that question of choice, right? Like, this is the choice, and bodily autonomy, all valid. However, they said there's a slight shift when we think about the global south. And it doesn't come down to what Shannon was getting at about choice necessarily and bodily autonomy, important, but it comes down to economics, right? Availability, and just practical reasons. Like, is this practical to increase a population when we're already struggling? What about those who already have children that can barely take care of them? So it's a very fascinating conversation, and all aspects of that have to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, we are missing out on the most vulnerable in our populations. We're missing out on the people who need the information the most, and the people who need to make decisions, as you just said, educated decisions, whatever their decision, whatever their choice and their needs, but they have to be educated. And how do we do that when there's so much misinformation going around about reproductive justice and rights, as well as particularly about abortion? I'll say this real quick. One of the big kind of conspiracy things that has made its kind of resurge, I feel like lately, but it was big a few decades ago, was this conspiracy theory that Margaret Sanger in particular was a eugenicist, and this was all to bring down the blacks, right? And I'll tell anyone outright, was Margaret Sanger racist? Probably. I don't know her personally. She's dead. Was she racist? Probably, as were most people, right? But is there and should there be a healthy distrust of the federal government when it comes to the bodies of Black persons? Absolutely, right? However, when we start getting into conspiracies and peddling misinformation as the basis of that, then we're getting to a really dangerous territory, right? Because that also goes into a territory where we are almost dehumanizing Black birthing persons too, that they should be able to have decisions of their own bodily autonomy, and that even before Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood were even in existence, they were seeking justice and rights as well too. So it almost erases their work, those persons who are Black and have been in this fight for decades, who have a rich history of this fight, and then to just say that, oh, but it's a conspiracy against us, how dare you, align with those things, is shameful. It's shameful, and it's really unfortunate. So I kind of went a little left of the question, so I'm gonna let Shannon pick up.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I want to just jump in real quick before you share, Shannon, and weigh in. I wanted to just say that piece about race. One of the things, and getting back to that conversation about information and knowledge, part of that is to understand that the experiences, and I want to make sure I put it properly. Female identified persons or birthing persons, of African descent, right? Historically in this country, the experience has been different. And the fight, while much of the goal has been the same, the fight hasn't always been the same, because some of the sort of tedious issues, some of the sort of day-to-day issues are different, right? And so part of that information is understanding that there is sort of a general movement, effort, right? But then there's also, for different communities, and we'll talk more about that, there's different communities that are having sort of grapple with this differently because their experiences are different. And so, yeah, and again, coming back to that intersectional conversation about how race plays into the conversation in a way that may be different from how a conversation of class will change our perspective, or a conversation about gender will change our perspective. So yeah, absolutely. But back to the original question. Shannon, go ahead, weigh in, please.
Well, I'll kind of do my best, but I mean, it's kind of connected to what both of you said too. I mean, we're talking about repro rights, and then we're also talking about reproductive justice, talking about the fight and who's been doing the fight. It wasn't out. I mean, up until the 90s, reproductive justice wasn't openly discussed, wasn't performed, wasn't dealt with. It was only primarily 12 Black women that this is Clinton healthcare reform, and they were going to change everything. And people like Loretta Ross went, this y'all aren't taking into consideration who is really impacted. You're not taking into consideration criminal system. You're not taking into consideration location, income, safety, these type of things. And they split off and went on their own and met. And they came up with what truly now is the basis of our reproductive justice framework. And I also must include Black trans women that have been doing the work long before too. Marsha P. Johnson, they've been doing it. Black women they've been doing this. And it was in the 90s that they came up with this idea, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit. You have the right to have or not have a child. You have the right to, if you want to have a child, to have them in a safe environment. Be able to raise them in the way you want, in the best environment you can. And of course, bodily autonomy. That's key to reproductive justice. It's not just about abortion, as you're mentioning. And getting back to your other question too about what does this all mean and how it impacts other communities, we're already hearing talk now that they're considering Roe Wade being falling, that they're starting to look at other laws that have to do with privacy laws, like about contraception, about the same-sex marriage. I mean, all this discussions about the being able to interracial marriage or even sex, all of that, they're connecting that once Roe Wade goes, right there goes that right to privacy, that 14th Amendment, they've got it, and they're going to be able to, it's going to be impacting other groups beyond just what we're talking about, connection to abortion.
Which is really fascinating too, Shannon, about the privacy piece. And in a sense, for many, they would see this as like some kind of government overstep, right? But the very people who appear to be against having this access and these rights are the same ones who would be quick to say, nope, the government doesn't have a say over what I do. And that ties to, and this may surprise people because it surprised me too, the Southern Baptist Convention back in the 70s made their resolutions, which are their kind of statements, and that they kind of govern themselves by as they have those needs that come up within their denomination. But right after Roe v. Wade, they made a series of statements and resolutions to make sure that persons, and women in particular, had access to abortion, because they knew that the government should have a limited role and say in that matter. And it's fascinating to see just how that has kind of flipped and turned the other way. And we're almost, I mean, people say it kind of in a joking, sarcastic way, but I think I find it to become true. We're working backwards. We're going backwards.
I think one of the words that we keep using is access. And I think, when we talk about some of the disparities and the ways in which communities are impacted differently, and we're sort of framing reproductive rights, reproductive justice as something beyond beyond abortion. And as you're both talking about this access, right? Access to proper health care, access to being able, as you were saying, Shannon, about being able to raise your children, care for your children, and even have proper health care for them as birthing persons, and being sure that whatever your decision is in terms of your body autonomy, whatever your decision is, that you can do that in a safe and healthy environment. And so, some of these questions and concerns about what happens if Roe v. Wade is rolled back, I'm not so sure that we're prepared for the ramifications of what happens, because we're living in a different time. And the people of this nation, in general, feel more autonomous in their daily lives. And so to sort of strip back their level of autonomy, I'm just interested to see how that's going to all play out. And I'm not sure that I'm prepared for what that's going to look like, and some of the fallout from that. I want to talk a little bit about And I mentioned sort of briefly about forced sterilizations as an example of one of the ways that we've seen the issue of reproductive rights, reproductive justice sort of come to bear. And it's one of those ways in which we see many of these intersections that we're talking about coming together in a particular moment. And I was thinking about forced sterilizations. I use Fannie Lou Hamer as an example. I also mentioned North Carolina eugenics movement. But it sort of makes me think about sort of fast forwarding. And we talked, Shannon mentioned a more current, what's happening in a more current context around reproductive rights, reproductive justice. And it makes me think about the experiences of female identified persons in these ICE detention centers. I was reading an article earlier today about some of those experiences. What are some of the threads in terms of the lack of autonomy, the lack of access, the sort of restrictions on reproductive health? What are some of the threads that we see between, forced sterilization as an example, and the experiences of women or female identified persons in detention centers, or other experience, or other moments, or other situations that sort of bring us back to this moment of a lack of autonomy, a lack of access, sort of ignoring standard, violating rights. So what are some of the threads that we see?
For me, I see a common thread of white supremacy. I see a thread of targeting marginalized groups, maintaining control over them. Because if you can control someone's body, someone's ability to reproduce, and we're not just talking physically, emotionally controlling them. Like you mentioned North Carolina, Lane Riddick. I mean, so many, all these different cases. When you can control someone's body, their ability to reproduce, it impacts not only them emotionally, culturally. Look at all the indigenous. 2/3 of the indigenous pregnant by 1975, mid 1970s, have been sterilized, and it impacted their culture greatly. It's also interesting. The groups are going after in Puerto Rico, targeting those pregnant persons, targeting those incarcerated as well. In California, I mean, over 20,000 were sterilized over decades. For me, I see it very much control and connected to those ideas of white supremacy. Patriarchy obviously are tied into it, and it's also mandating the reproduction, once again, not only of persons, but the reproduction of culture, ideas, society to it.
I agree with everything Shannon just said, particularly that white supremacy piece, which people, love to say, you bring race into everything. No, race was made as a part of everything. So there are definitely some racial aspects at play. But the only other thing I would say is I just see that commonality of dehumanization. And it's so unfortunate as somebody, a clergy person, and I have a love of people and a care for people. And I like to see people, as human, right? As one of us, as part of my community. And it just hurts my heart so bad to see this dehumanization take place when, we already had the dehumanization of incarcerating persons, right? And then we've already separated them from society. We've already said that they are no longer worthy to get certain rights and benefits and privileges, right? And then to add this on top of it, how awful, right? Those who are immigrating, refugees, and just trying to get to safety, trying to get to a better place, already treating them like less than, second class, if not third or no class citizens. And then to add this on top of it, the forced sterilization, the taking away of that bodily autonomy, it's salt in the wound, right? And it's a really slippery slope towards more ways of finding ways to dehumanize one another. And that's just not good for any of us humans, to find ways to further dehumanize one another.
Excellent points from both of you. Thank you so much. I just have this question is a little personal. My students and I often sort of grapple with, as we sort of trace the experiences of Americans as it relates to gender throughout history. and the distinctions. And we've talked about, and of course, there's the different layers to that, right? Where race and class create some more complexity. But patriarchy was the word that's been used this evening. So, one of the questions that I sort of have to grapple with, and my students as younger people who are sort of hearing these stories and reading the news, and but not necessarily fully aware of not just the current ramifications, but sort of all of the threads that this, is attached to. My question continues to be, we have had, and historically the idea is that the experiences, and I'm using traditional terms of man and woman, because historically the notion was that the lives of women were considered private, right? The things that she did, her body, all those things were considered private. They were supposed to remain private. And the men had the ability to live more publicly. But I think it's kind of ironic that the woman's body, this discussion about, abortion, birthing, reproductive health, the process itself, this has become a very public and a very political conversation. Can we talk a little bit about that irony? Or do we find it ironic, or is it just me? Either, jump in, doesn't matter, either one, jump
Sorry,
in.
you want to go? You want me?
Hey, you start. I'm getting my thoughts together because this is interesting, and I do find it ironic. But you go ahead.
It is ironic, though not surprising when you look at where we are. I'm not surprised. I think something you mentioned just made me think about, when we're talking about the 19th century, and all of a sudden these laws began to and talking about the bodies of pregnant people, of women and men different and everything. What's kind of leading up to that is ownership. Once again, we're coming to ownership, ideas about reproduction. Also, ironically, the medical profession were targeting these quote unquote irregular doctors, which were midwives, healers, predominantly women that were were providing abortions, contraception, a huge thing. Never mind, we can go down the path of the witch hunts and stuff. Well, we won't go there because I could talk all day about that. But it seemed it's very selective when it's time to restrict body autonomy. It is selective. It is very much politicized, as Tara's mentioned, as well as you. It's not been consistent. You can look at the timeline and you can trace what's going on, and especially in the United States, what's going on politically, with all of a sudden we start caring about this, and then it goes back down, which leads to the irony.
I agree. And as Dr. Dixon-McKnight was talking, I think the term historians or others have used were about the spheres of influence, right? So that the man was very public, outspoken, handled that kind of stuff, politics. That's men's business, versus what they considered ideal woman should be that sphere of influence at the home, the private, the domestic, and even of course at one point the very spiritual affairs, right? Women were considered more pure and spiritual. So I think it is really interesting, ironic in a sense, but like Shannon, I'm not surprised, because the same issues we've seen in history repeating itself is when I love the quote of when a woman has stepped out of place, right? How dare she try to control the narrative? How dare she try to speak up for herself? How dare she speak up for other women? Because that requires speaking back to who? A man, right? Absolutely not. So it's no surprise that as we see, particularly in the United States, the acknowledgement, I won't say too much of the shrinking, but there is a little bit, very small, minute shrinking, but at least the acknowledgement of that. Those who have been in power historically have been white cis men, as that privilege is being acknowledged and recognized and shrinking just a little bit. It's a threat. So what do? We go back to the ways that we've done before. We repeat that history. And so we need to wrangle in these women folk. We need to wrangle in these marginalized folk. They're getting a little too big for their britches. We got to wrangle them back in and show them who's in charge, in a sense. So yeah, ironic, but not surprising.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me. And it's interesting to watch young folk grapple with these things because they don't live in a world where they don't have that freedom, right? They don't necessarily understand sort of the historical context that has had to unfold in order for them to have the right, but then to not sort of grapple with the fact that before that the right is being rolled back, that the right to privacy, the right to access, those types of things are being rolled back. I want to take a few minutes to get to some questions to make sure we have time to sort of cover some of this before we wrap up. One of the questions came in was a question about what's the thought about the future of abortion access? And I think you touched a little bit on this already, Shannon, about the access to abortion in North Carolina. If Wade is rolled back, what do we think about the access to abortion over the next 6 months or so?
We do not have trigger laws that I was talking about right now. I believe Annette said South Carolina, there's quite a few states that do have trigger laws, which automatically will ban abortion. We already have restrictions a lot of people don't know of that's in place. For example, we have a 72-hour waiting period where if you are seeking abortion care, you have to get a consultation within 72 hours. We're only one of 5 states that has that length of time. We also, and this matters because this is going to impact things. Even though abortion may not be banned by a trigger law immediately, we don't have telemedicine. So what that means, if someone in North Carolina wants to get an abortion pill mailed, which in some states you can, like Georgia has that, mailed to you, you can't do that in North Carolina. So even though certain things are mandated by state, as opposed to federal, if a doctor is out of state and prescribes someone in North Carolina, that they could lose their license, they could be fined. That's going to be restricted even more. I think what it means for North Carolina, at least in the next 6 months, is unfortunately, I think we might see a couple more clinics closing just for multiple reasons. I also think, and I think Tina mentioned this, I've seen that, yeah. Seeking abortion sanctuary states like NC will increase by 8,000%. And that's a very fair estimate. We're going to start seeing people traveling, seeking care. And what that means is you're going to see this trickle down effect. So if you've got people going from moving this state to this state to this state, and the ones that are in the state where it's legal may not be able to get appointments, may not be able to get that care, and the financial burden, absolute financial burden of the people traveling, but also the people that are seeking funding for assistance. It's going to be so depleted. And that's why abortion funds are going to be so important as well to help, because that goes beyond, that's anything, transportation, babysitters, those type of things. All of that is going to be just so bogged down.
I agree with Shannon. I also think, of course, we're going to see that initial bump. It's going to be huge, really, at first, where people, last minute, going to have to make a choice that they may or may not want to make, but because the pressure is going to be on, right, of how long they will have this access, how much time. Of course, we know her name escapes me, but from Roe v. Wade, you see that time escaped her before she was even had a chance to get a verdict or anything. So we're going to see a huge stress on those mutual aid groups, the foundations that are trying to help people have access and equity for their reproductive justice. And a number of people, as Shannon just said, traveling. That strain is going to be intense. But 6 months down the line, I'm not exactly sure what it would look like. The things I'm thinking now are not the best. Honestly, it's not very hopeful because, again, when it comes down to it, people are going to do what they think they need to do. And that's what really scares me. They're going to take some risk, some steps that without this access and availability and legality, it's not going to be pretty.
I had something real quick to that. I definitely agree with Tara, but I also think that at certain points in history, there have been movements, there have been communities where people like the Jane movement in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. There's going to be communities that help support those seeking abortion care. It's just going to be more difficult. It's going to be dangerous for those helping too. I mean, let's look at the laws on the books now. 10,000, 100,000, we charge them all of these different things. But I do have faith in community, and I have faith in justice, and I have faith in groups of people when they come together with passion and with love and with knowledge that they will be able to help those seeking access.
Is that bad that Shannon has more faith in the community than I do?
No,
just joking. I'm just joking.
I'm just trying to happy spin. Tara knows me. Tara knows I'm not always like this. I'm trying, but there is truth to what I'm saying. That it has happened, but it is scary right now. And I think what you're saying, Dr. Dixon-McKnight, too, about youths don't understand. They're going to know, unfortunately, what it's like to not have access, and it's going to trickle down and impact in different ways.
Right, because like Shannon said too, that as of right now, we don't have to worry about those trigger laws here in North Carolina, but elections are coming up, people. You don't know what's going to come down, who's going to run on what platform to be able to say, let's get that here, let's change it here. What about here? So all I can say is I would say you have to stay alert. It's so much going on, but we have to stay alert because I think a lot of the strategies are to distract us from so many just different moving pieces. A lot is happening so fast. Literally every day we're seeing reports of different states, this restriction, but now it's slightly this and slightly different. And it's confusing. It's confusing and hard to keep up with.
I think one of my biggest concerns is I think about those communities that are already marginalized, that are already underserved, that already have a sort of tense relationship with healthcare in general. And so when laws change, when access changes, these are the communities that are not only often underserved, but also are sort of don't have as much information in terms of what's available. And so I fear that one of the sort of ramifications will be on human life, and how people are going to be able to maneuver in these situations, and if they'll be able to maneuver in these situations in a way that's healthy. And it's frustrating because with all of the sort of medical advances that we have at our disposal in this country at this point, people shouldn't have situations where they're having to manage their health care on their own or in a way that's unhealthy, right, and unsafe. We have a number of questions, but I wanted to get to one because we're running out of time. That's sort of a big question. And the question is to sort of think about how what we have going on here in the US in terms of abortion laws and access and things of those sorts, how it compares to the global community, how that compares to what's happening in other countries. Do you all have thoughts about that? Okay. Tara, you want to go first?
Sure. I was going to let Shannon, she's much better at the numbers and figures than I am. But one, and I'm sure we'll get to a portion with some resources. Hope I'm pronouncing it right. But what is it? Guttmacher? Guttmacher.org has some wonderful resources and data and stats for anyone who may be really curious about some hard figures and what's going on globally as we keep track of restrictions and abortion and repro rights and justice worldwide. So I would just first say that's a really good resource. I hate to use the term developing countries, but I can't think of another term right now. We know that in more countries that are still developing, but take that with a grain of salt. The access conversation, as I kind of mentioned earlier, particularly about Global South, the conversation isn't even strictly about bodily autonomy at that point. It is still about where's this money going to come from? If we're already impoverished, how are we going to care for another body? Can we focus, instead of on these specific laws, on laws that will uplift us all as a community, right? Access to contraceptives, before we even get to the scary part for many people, the abortion part. Where are we there? So that's a conversation in developing countries. But when we start to compare the US to comparable countries, as you might want to call it, we're ashamed. There are so many other countries that this fight, this debate is, I don't want to say over necessarily, but it's not the conversation right now. It's yes, a birthing person should, of course, decide what happens. Of course, they're going to be taken care of. Of course, a new parent gets time off to care for their new one. Of course, they get paid. Of course, we're going to make sure children are fed. Meanwhile, here, we're still arguing over the basic of someone's needs being met. So, of course, we're still arguing and discussing the rights and access that we have here, where in so many other countries, they're beyond that. So that's what I will say.
Thank you. Go ahead, Shannon.
No, Tara said it perfectly. I agree wholeheartedly. I did give, I think, a resource with that website, and it tells you all that information about a worldview and percentages and stuff. So, yeah, thank you. Oh, it popped up. No, I agree. I could have said it better. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, so one final question, and then we're going to wrap this up. Because we've raised you, no, excuse me, not we, you all have raised some really key points and given us a lot to think about. So the question I would ask in just a few words from each of you: what needs to change? What can we do better in regards to this issue?
I'm seeing in the chat constantly laws, vote, inform yourself, have conversations, learn not only about the base laws, but learn about the people, the communities that these laws are impacting, and look beyond just the issue of abortion, because this is way bigger than abortion, way bigger than reproductive rights or anything. So that would be, I think people can relate to this on a lot of different levels beyond what they thought initially.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It can't be stressed enough. It may be the cliche answer, but yeah, educate yourself. You're gonna have to know what's going on, and you can kind of stay in a vein that maybe feels right for you. So if you know that you're kind of into the political, the legislative side of things, educate yourself on that. What is happening with these laws? What's happening in not only your state, but other states that impact your state, states right around. North Carolina has to be very cognizant of what's going on in South Carolina, for example, particularly here in Charlotte, because guess where they're going to have to go for access, right? So I would say education on that side. If it's the activism kind of side, there's so many great resources. Shannon already mentioned Loretta Ross's organization that was Sister Song, and the great information they have there. Maybe you just need to look at some statistics and facts and understand how this is impacting your community. Get that information right from goopmacher.org, as we mentioned. If you want to understand on a broader scale, if you want to make sure you're not in that echo chamber, right? Pew Center Research always has really good, relevant conversations, and you can put in contrasting ideas even to research. If you want to know specifically about religion, what people that are identified as religious are thinking about these issues and topics, I think that's a great place to go. So I would just say educate yourself, look into the information for yourself. Don't just pick up what either politicians, preachers, or anyone else says about the matter. Educate yourself, but that also includes, like Shannon said, hearing stories. Listen to the people who firsthand have this experience, have this knowledge and this information, because their experience is not any less important or any less valid than someone else who has articles throughout a journal or a publication.
I agree with everything that you've both said. I think, I can't express enough how key that knowledge piece is. In my mind, knowledge is the thing that will turn this entire thing around, and not just on this issue. In my mind, it's every issue. If we understand, and as a historian, I always point people back to the what has been and what has happened, because there's such a pervasive lack of knowledge in regards to how things have evolved over time. We don't always understand where these issues stem from. We don't always understand sort of how we've gotten to the point where we are now, to even understand how to build going forward. And so it's so incredibly important for us to understand the history, and to be, and as Shannon mentioned, to be involved and engaged citizens, right? Exercising that vote and understanding that, yes, that one voice, right, makes all the difference, and that one vote can make all the difference. So it's so important to engage in that way. I just want to take time to say thank you to both of you. It has been a wonderful conversation. I've learned so much. My little paper is so full of notes over here. I'm so excited to take this information back and share it with the people around me. And so thank you both for joining us. It has been a wonderful discussion. To those of you that are in the viewing audience right now, and maybe even those that watch it later as a recording, please make sure that you do the feedback survey link, or give us feedback via the survey link, because it's important for the Levine to know how well these events go, so that they can work on programming future discussions. And so thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to both of you, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.